teenagers going, wow, I wish I could play rock and roll racing. That looks so cool. You do, don't you? Well, we still have the game, right?
It just works. Thanks for making the time.
Yeah, so my name is Nick Bowman. I'm a PhD who is an associate professor at Syracuse University in the Newhouse School of Public Communications. And a lot of my research comes from a media psychology background. So I look at how people interact with and their motivations for using and how they're affected by games and other interactive media. So anytime that the person can touch the screen or touch a button and interact with the machine, I want to know what that's like psychologically. And I've been doing that research for nearly 15 years now.
All right, so how did you get started with that?
Yeah, it wasn't planned, I'll tell you that. I grew up as a gamer. In fact, behind me are a lot of my old games. They're still in my office. I still play when I'm stressed out or when I want a couple of minutes to break. I was a journalist, and I had gone to school for journalism. And when I was doing my doctorate, I came onto a research team that was studying media violence and media mood management and how people sort of use video games as a form of leisure. I didn't realize people studied that. So, I'm 40 years old. I grew up with games. They were just a part of my life, but it was always kind of invisible, right? You didn't really talk about it that much. It wasn't a cool thing to do. And to see academics wanting to understand the role of video games in people's lives was fascinating to me. So frankly, as the gamer on the team, I just had a lot of thoughts about which game to use, which game not to use. 4 years later, I was finishing a PhD and doing, media effects research, and I just never stopped. So that was in 2005, and I haven't stopped since then.
It's possible to just set a few definitions, if you could define what retro gaming is.
Yeah, so this is a tough one, honestly. I'm not sure that there's a clean definition of retro gaming, but when I approach retro gaming to me are either games of the past or games that recall the past. So of the past would be those cartridges, those physical systems, those pieces of information that came from the 20th century at this point, right? Recalling the past are going to be those products and properties that pay homage to those things. Chip tuning, pixel art. So I don't want to exclude the, ones that remix and borrow elements of. So I would say retro games are either of the past or they recall the past. Now, the past is always going to be an intentionally floating term. And my participants, 18 years old, their idea of a retro game is the N64. It's that generation of 64-bit consoles. That freaks me out. To me, it's that Atari sitting behind me, right? That's okay. Definitions don't have to define a static experience so much as a dynamic experience. So, of the past, no longer in production, right? Off the shelves.
And if I can be of any reassurance to you, to me, retro games start at the GameCube or the Game Boy. So.
Okay.
A little extra stab.
In my mind, it was. This is funny because in my research we used 1995, and that was when the PS1 dropped. So you have your CD-based medium. It's when you had the rise of the PC game. And the argument that we had used is that's when you started seeing pixels, not polygons, not pixels. Digital sound, not MIDI sound. And it was a technological break. And from basically the mid-90s on, those games have a lot of similar building blocks to modern games. Whereas pre-95, those games don't share as many technological elements and features. It's mostly digital, it's mostly MIDI, it's mostly pixel. But again, that could be debated for a year and not solved.
What are you working on at the moment?
We always have an idea, and then there's always something else to do. It's the curse of the academic. But right now, I've been doing a lot of research on media nostalgia, and especially how gamers, both young and old, go back to the past, whether it's their past or somebody else's past. I've been increasingly interested in the role that digital worlds play in terms of sense of place, how you can feel a connection to a location you've never been to, especially if we can start getting into like immersive reality and technologies that allow you to really temporarily separate yourself from your environment, right? We learned during COVID, I think, the power of being able to leave while staying at home. So those are probably two main areas of work, and then I'm sure if you asked me tomorrow, there'd be something new.
So what pushes young people like me to go discover retro games?
So what we're seeing, you can't quite see, it's a bit off camera, but I have my dad's vinyl records in my basement, and I play them all the time. They're not from my childhood. I mean, he played them, but they weren't mine, right? It's much of the same motivation. So when we talk about nostalgia, there are really two different kinds of nostalgia. There's personal nostalgia, which is your own personal history. And then there is a historical nostalgia, which is having an affinity or a desire to return to places from the bygone eras, much in the way the popularity of a 1950s diner is in the United States, right? What we're seeing in these situations is that younger gamers especially are recognizing that the medium is nearly 60 years old. And it's their opportunity to go back in the past and see what it was like in the beginning. So in a way, it's almost a bit of paying respect to the gods of yore, and also understanding what it was like when you only had, a 2-button controller, right? When this was all you had to control everything from an airplane to a Jeopardy board. And we're just seeing an appreciation for the history of gaming.
Yeah, and I mean, especially the technical aspect of it. I've talked with a lot of retro gamers and collectors about how constraints made games much more thoughtful in a sense.
Absolutely. You had this situation where you realize the creativity that went into these what seemed like very simple experiences. But if anybody's ever played an old Mega Man game, for the NES, they can get really complicated really fast. When you notice an item box in the top right corner of the screen and seemingly no way to get to it, and at some point you start learning how the gamer had to leverage the features of the system to afford themselves the ability to bounce off this and find this and the hidden block here to grab that little box. Not that new games aren't fun. They're creative in very different ways. But there was so much more you had to get around. Even things like learning that for an NES, you could overload the processor to slow down the game, right? If you let too many enemies on screen, you get slow motion, not because you put in a code, but because the game couldn't handle it all. And a lot of gamers my age will play emulated versions of old games. And the thing that we don't like is those bugs are gone. So I'm used to winning by cheating a little bit, and then I'm playing on my computer through an HDMI cable on my NES. I'm like, oh, wait a minute, you're supposed to slow down. So I think you're right. I think it's historical tourism. I've seen in my research where gamers have actually talked about playing their parents' video games, and it's become a bonding point where they can actually just like I talk to my dad about classic rock and roll. My nieces and nephews talk to me about what it was like to play that Atari or what it was like to play that Super Nintendo. And it becomes a fun point of departure, not to mention for those younger players, it gives them a sense of identity as a gamer. And it's like, okay, I understand the form above and beyond my experience with it. And so those are some of the reasons we're seeing why these programs are really economically valuable and culturally valuable, even though they shouldn't be. I mean, if you've got an Xbox Series X and a Super Nintendo, why are they on the same shelf? And yet here we are.
Yeah, to get back to what you were saying about kind of hacking, not hacking, but cheating by using the hardware that was present at the time. I don't know if you know this YouTube channel, Summoning Salt, where they go into really nitty-gritty details about how world speed records are broken. And I think that that also goes into one of my questions about how streaming affected retro games' popularity. Because I'd like to know your thoughts about these kinds of games are, to me, how retro gaming started gaining traction.
I think when the streamers got involved, it legitimized the passion. So the retro gaming passion's always been there. I remember one of my first jobs in high school was working at a used game store before companies like GameStop got involved in the industry. And so the used game store in town would take old games, trade them in for a couple of dollars, and you can buy, a new game. And in the beginning, us gamers, we just got rid of all of our old games. Like the moment that the Sega Saturn came out, like here's my Genesis and every game ever. And so you saw this thing where gamers just got rid of all their stuff during the console wars. They wanted 64 bits, right? Not 32, not 16. Well, those stores kept that stuff. And then you started seeing slightly older gamers come in and recognize behind the glass case all these Nintendo tapes, all these Sega Master System cartridges or Mega Drive cartridges, and pick them up cheap. And so it kind of kept things going. eBay comes along and helps that, the global garage sale, right, where people can pick up these systems and games. But that was always a small community, and you wouldn't have just gone to the store and talked to somebody about retro games. What streaming did, like it did for so many other bits of culture, is it mainstreamed it. Not by making everybody love it, but by giving everybody an opportunity to get involved and see it. So whether you were an older gamer hopping on Reddit one day or cruising through YouTube one day and hearing the Mario theme song and just stopping in your tracks, right? Or you were a younger gamer coming across the top 10 channels for the day and one of them was a speed run. It really, I think, told the industry and told the gamers, people don't want to let these properties go. So I think in the 2000s, we were all hiding in the shadows of emulation, which was quasi-legal, and we just didn't talk about it. Now we're back again. And so streaming played a really big role in giving it some legitimacy and reminding people that there's a thirst for this experience. Again, much in the way we think about music stations. And so it just like you could find the classic rock station on your local radio, you can now find the classic game station on your local Twitch, right?
I love your dog in the background, by the way.
Oh yeah, Sadie the bull is going to be hopping around here.
Wonderful. I love it. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. Do you watch these kinds of streams?
I don't as much as I probably should. Partly my media diet, I love playing. And the other one is because I play so much, sometimes I have to get away from the screen, right? But I do on occasion, especially when I'm at the office. I'll often run them in the background. I always had these thoughts that I would run my own. I do have an Elgato card. The problem I have, and you're going to laugh at me, I don't like running the emulations or the HDMI systems. I want to run that system. Technologically, it's a nightmare to purchase the equipment to go from old school RF cable to HDMI, and you end up getting it in this window that's about that big. So I'm cheap, but maybe one of these days I'll finally, between that cabinet behind me and these cabinets here, there's about 600 games, retro games. And I want to stream those. I don't want to stream the emulation file. So
yeah, because I've just gotten myself analog to digital converter, not for gaming,
oh, cool.
but for converting my dad's VHS tapes. Because that kind of goes back to our conversation, like
sure,
retro media, retro things that aren't accessible, that are like treasure troves of memories,
right?
That you're trying to convert into to access as the newer generation or as your generation, your own generation, but like going back to the past.
Absolutely.
So I that's not a question, but
yeah, no, but it's a good point to make. Like I think people tend to be very cynical about retro, and they say that it's lazy, that you're just tapping people's memories and exploiting them. That's not fair. There's a lot of research from psychology that suggests that returning to a past self, even temporarily, can be a source of well-being. It can be sort of a source of mental health, to kind of remind you of who you were, or to give you a positive memory in a sea of negative experiences, or to think about your family and friends. In fact, one of the findings that was very unexpected for us was a number of college students today, 18, 19, 20 years old, that when they would recall a gaming memory, the game wasn't as important as the people they were playing it with. They would talk about their parents, They would talk about their cousins over a holiday. You know, all the cousins sit at the kids' table for Thanksgiving, like in the garage, and there's like a Xbox in there or something. And the game was the catalyst for the relationship, but the relationship's what they remember. That was powerful, and we didn't expect that, and we didn't expect it to happen so often. In fact, it's an area of investigation I want to dig into a little further. And I've got some colleagues in the UK and in Germany and here in the US where we're working on trying to better understand that almost autobiographical experience. And I think it's because we somewhat don't respect games in the way we respect other media. But we have to realize that for 2020s, gaming is almost mundane. I mean, it's in so many places. It's a legitimate, near ubiquitous experience. So we are going to start seeing games be the memory, you know.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of a normalization of gaming. I've talked with a lot of people back in Hong Kong who are saying, like, back in the day, especially in Hong Kong, there was this whole arcade scene which was kind of shady, kind of sketchy.
Right.
So it's not exactly the same everywhere in the world, but they're kind of more prominent in the West, I'd say, was the phenomenon of moral panic, which I perused your extensive Google Scholar page.
Ah, cool.
And basically each one I'd like to talk to you about. We only have limited time for
Absolutely.
this interview. But I'd like to know, well, how do moral panics come about?
Yeah, so moral panic is something, it's essentially when one group doesn't like what another group is doing, which is quite common, there's a presumption of deviancy. So us and them. They're doing something we don't like. And we presume that there are negative effects or that it's damaging without evidence. And so moral panics don't mean there wasn't really a danger and we pretended there was. It's we don't know if there's an actual danger. And so for video games, the famous one is from the 70s, a game called Death Race. And my colleague Carly Karosek writes about this extensively, where she argues that the start of the video game violence debate was basically 1975. Death Race comes out. It's an arcade game with a steering wheel and pedals. And you can control a car where you run over gremlins. And when you hit the gremlins, they scream, and you get points. And you can imagine this shocked people. It's a murder simulator. People are going to go and they're going to leave the arcade and they're going to hit each other with their cars. And that could happen. But there wasn't any evidence of that. It was a presumption. And you got to think the presumption was more about, I already don't like video games. I think they're silly. By the 1970s, they're mostly in adult bars, maybe starting to see some arcades for children. But there wasn't any evidence, and so there wasn't any empirical, objective or impartial view. It was the group that already doesn't like it now has a thing that they can glom onto, and that's what moral panics are in a nutshell. And how they represented in gaming is that traditionally games have been thought of as sort of throwaway, trash, lowbrow, children. It's things you do when you can't do anything else. It's a very ableist approach. Real kids go outside and play baseball and they run in the fields. And non-normative kids go into their basement and hunt goblins. And you can see now where we already don't like what you're doing. So now anytime there's something that goes wrong with it, immediately, games, obviously. If you just got rid of the games, you wouldn't have any of these social problems like violence or kids not doing well in school. And we can see how that logic doesn't quite work in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously, it links back to the fact that, as you said, there was this stigma against gaming and stigma against, much more stigma, I'd say, from what I've gathered, against people who weren't in the norm back in the day.
Yes.
Obviously, we still have massive issues today, but I think that acceptance of this kind of weirdness, this kind of geekiness about topics is much more normal nowadays
Sure.
than back in the day.
Yeah, there's a combination of this sort of resurgence in nerd culture, like the popularity of the Marvel movies kind of gave comic fans like myself a time in the spotlight. Streaming has been so popular that gaming is starting to kind of pour out. Not to mention people get older. right? I mean, again, I'm 40. I grew up with video games. I don't have children, but lots of my friends and colleagues do, and they also grew up with games. So for us, it's not weird anymore. It was just part of the experience. So you could see how the generation before us was kind of scared, whereas the generation now doesn't see it as anti-normative because it was normative to them. And that's a cycle that will always continue. There'll always be a new technology. I already have students in my classes right now who express moral panics over the kids and their smartphones. So you see it right in front of you. And it's not to say there aren't any effects, negative effects, but when you hear the logic and the debates, they're almost the same argument. It's going to make you aggressive. It's going to pull you away from your friends. It's going to do all these things. And I'm like, no, you're confusing content with cultural experience. And I think what you're saying is you're just not used to somebody doing something different.
And I think that covers a large amount of every social phenomenon going on right now.
Sure.
Obviously, there are attenuating factors for things such as TikTok or social media, which have a really weird impact on people.
Sure.
That's kind of out of the scope of this documentary, so I'll keep it on topic. But yeah, I think it's interesting to see that and how it also impacts moral panic, because moral panics have evolved from street...
Oh, Death Race, yeah.
It's evolved from Death Race, where it was in the 70s, to where we are now, where it's kind of weird, mixed with incels talking about FPS games when they shoot up schools. It's grown to something much weirder. So if you could you explain a bit how that happened?
Sure. I think that one takes a bit of a pause at the history of gaming. And this is from one perspective, but as the graphics got better, the portrayals got more intense. And so if you follow my most knowledgeable experiences in the United States, if you follow the growth of the Entertainment Software Ratings Board, the ESRB, that came out of the game Night Trap, where you had like a simulated slumber party, kind of pseudo-sexual, male stalker, females in lingerie running around a house and trying to get them, and kind of revealing and sexually suggestive, right? Mortal Kombat. I remember Mortal Monday, famously. The game where you had CGI rendered actors, and you could rip their spines out and take a bite out of their organs and explode them with a punch. The graphics got better; they got more intense. I think throughout the 80s and 90s, especially again in the U.S., the focus was on teenage boys. So the marketing was, tongue-in-cheek sexual humor, toxic masculinity, overt violence, reinforcing a lot of themes that I think today would not have been acceptable. But that was the flavor of the month then. It was masculine, blood, boobs, right? That was the marketing. So you had sexism as in violence as king. So you really were like pushing some envelopes, and you were just begging to be regulated. Right? And I think unlike other media, comic books went through their moral panic. The difference there was the mainstream comic book didn't really have a lot of salacious material, but the salacious material got highlighted. I think in gaming, the salacious material really was kind of dominant. I don't think anybody could reasonably argue in the 90s that Mortal Kombat wasn't a top game. So yeah, Mario's not sexist or not violent. It does have sexist overtones. I mean, everyone rescue the princess. Heaven forbid she, is empowered to be an agent of her own desire, right? And we can talk about the hero's journey and those issues, but the violence parts weren't as prevalent. But of course, Doom, Wolfenstein, Mortal Kombat, all of that fed a fire that really got people concerned. And admittedly, it's hard to explain why it's okay for kids to murder each other every Tuesday night, from 9 to midnight. It's weird. And if your kid's acting up in school and the industry is saying, yeah, be a man, murder your friends, right? And the marketing is very much like be king, be a misogynist. That's a bad recipe. And I think that's where a lot of that came from. So carrying over today, honestly, we still see it. We still see a group of gamers that protect that 90s stigma of what a gamer is. You see a lot of gatekeeping, who's allowed to be in the Reddit forum and who's not allowed to be in the Reddit forum. And you see a lot of that today, and we can deny it all we want to, but hop on Reddit, spend 10 minutes reading into these cultures. And now, does that represent every gamer? No. But I mean, they're the loud ones sometimes. And I shouldn't say they, because, but you see this dynamic emerging. And so those elements, I think, used to own video games. And there's a sense of you're playing in my sandbox. And I don't think you see that necessarily with other media. So it certainly fuels moral panic concerns when, if I've put you on the outside, I've made you the them, and then I now am upset you're mad at me. It's like, well, you also kind of put your own gates around your hobby for 20 years, and now you're mad that people don't like your hobby. That's going to be an issue. So I think that fuels some of the moral panic in ways that were unique to other types of entertainment media. Although we do see it a bit in comics as well.
Yeah, I'm not a huge comics fan, so I can't speak to moral panics in comics. But speaking of people trying to rejecting gaming as it has been, or rejecting gaming as it is, I personally, for me, one of the pushes to go for retro gaming is kind of its more open nature, rejecting in part what gaming has become today.
Okay.
Which I don't know what you think about NFTs and microtransactions and all that stuff. So for me, gaming is in part an ideology of, returning to games that respect the gamer, that respect you by offering you a complete experience, and by, just going back to an experience which is enjoyable for everyone and doesn't feel exploitative. Is that something that you have a comment on? Or
I've never thought about it in those terms. In part because I've focused so much on the experience from a nostalgic perspective, and I've not done justice to some of the critical cultural perspectives. That being said, I have often commented on, or had research subjects or participants comment on the fact that they like when their relationship with the publisher ended when I bought the cartridge. And you'll often hear people say something along the lines like, if I go open one of those drawers, I could pull a tape out. This is Contra. I bought this in 1980 something. Right? Once I bought it and left the store, it was mine. And I could do what I want with it. I could own it, I could play it, I could stick it in my machine, I could do what I want. There were no updates, there were no, many gamers comment today. I like the language you used, respect the gamer, and I might say respect their time and their intelligence a bit. I've been frustrated. I have a PS5 and I love it. The number of times I want to sit down and play a game after work, and I click play, and it says updating, 12 minutes, and I have a gigabyte connection. And I just sit there going, I want to play this game because I'm very tired, and I just want 15 minutes of racing cars, and I got to wait 12 minutes for that 15 minutes. The rise of the unfinished game. I'm one of the few. I was a Fallout fan and am, and I was a Fallout 76 player. I was one of the 7. I love that I was alone because it's a post-nuclear war. You're supposed to be alone. But remember, it was an unfinished game, right? I definitely get this notion, and I could see it being a bit of a foisted ideology. In many ways, maybe folks my age wouldn't quite catch it because to us it was just our past. But I could see younger gamers going, wow, y'all got to play this game where you just put a tape in that's 35 years old, no updates, no password, no buy season 1, but season 2's $12. No, the game is free, but if you want to go past level 5, you got to pay $6 here, $2 there, $1 there. I could see that being an ideology, almost like a grass is greener effect, that if you're a younger gamer, you never quite knew that was even a possibility. Buying a game digitally and finding out a month later you don't have access to it anymore because it changed servers. So, I could definitely see that being an ideology of contrast. So maybe not so much that the original games, the ideology of older games, frankly, would have been toxic young males, right? You get to play and nobody else can play. And we weren't thinking about the economics. But in contrast to what you have today, I can definitely see a return to a economically simpler time. And that's kind of interesting. I never quite thought about that before. I will say there was a ideology, I think, around software during the emulation movement, where all of our games were dying, and the publishers just refused to do anything about it. They wouldn't re-release them, but they kept enforcing the copyrights. Our tapes were dying, they were degrading, they were falling apart. And so I think you had a ideology of sort of saving data. And now I could see an ideology of respecting the gamer and maybe reminding newer developers that there were elements of older games that shouldn't just be put in the discount bin in a garage sale, but maybe we should go back and revisit those things.
But I mean, I think it's one of the draws that retro gaming has, which I find interesting as a
Sure.
segment.
No, I think it makes a lot of sense. I mean, if we think about that argument I used earlier for like, why I listen to my parents' music, right? Or why I might watch an older movie. You can see some elements of that. There's something about putting a vinyl record on a player and dropping the needle that's very different than going song by song through SoundCloud or through, Spotify or something like this. So part of it is the tactile experience. But I think it's very fair to think about the ideological experience. In fact, it's one that, as a media studies professor, I try to openly talk about that. What does it mean to consume something in a particular way? Like I said, I've heard shadows of conversation, and I've not directly researched the ideologies of retro gaming, but I've had participants in studies and colleagues talk about these notions of, being sort of unfettered. They say that a lot, or they'll talk a lot about how if I own the title, it's mine, and no one can take it away from me. And they'll often use that one. It's the one that sticks out the most. It's not editable. It's not unfinished. Like, no developer in the 90s would have dared release an unfinished game. It would have been the death knell for a company. And now you have AAA studios who do and go, whoops, here's the patch. It's going to be a 20 gigabyte patch, and you can have it for free 6 months later. I hope you're still cool with us. And we are. We're just used to that. And so updating it has been at once kind of neat when you can go into a game and they can update the splash page and update the rosters if you're a sports fan. But it also was kind of let folks off the hook, right? And with that, we can also think about retro games not in terms of older games, but people who develop retro style games who not only borrow, pixel art and chiptune, but they borrow economic structures. Like, give me $5, you can have this game. There's even people who now sell quasi-legal cartridges for old systems that you can buy online. And they release the game in a plastic box. And again, some of it's aesthetic, some of it's cultural, but some of it is probably ideological. There's something about that experience between the developer and the player. It's much more like making a meal. I made this pizza, you can have it. I'm not going to give you half a pizza. I'm not going to give you a pizza, but then the toppings are $1 a piece, and I'll put them on if you ask nicely. I'm just going to give it to you, and you can eat it. And if you like it, you'll come back. And if you don't like it, I'll never see you again. Right?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting thing to study in terms of how the gaming industry has adapted to this kind of thing, because you've got
Sure.
a whole industry formed around creating retro hardware accessories for retro hardware,
Right.
and reselling retro hardware. So, like, one thing that I've been curious
Right.
about, especially in Hong Kong, is CRTs, because Hong Kong switched to digital TV back in 2013.
Like those ones.
And most of the world has switched to digital in some form or another for their TV broadcasts. And it's interesting to see how that affects retro gaming, because now you have this whole industry going on eBay or trying to go to garage sales, but you can't find the really good things anymore as easily.
Oh, so there is a Reddit group called r/CRT, and all they do is highlight, showcase, and help people find CRTs. So as you mentioned, in so many cultures we shifted digital, and in many countries there were recycling programs to get rid of your CRTs, put them on the curb, sell them back, recycle them, break them down. They're heavy, they're toxic. Get rid of these things. Well, now people are going back and rescuing CRTs. A big source has been schools, going to like the local elementary school or primary school and getting their old AV cart. I have two behind me, and the reason I have two is if one breaks. And people go on and share them. I've even seen folks wire new systems like PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X into CRTs. It's been a really neat way to consume the product. And yeah, the interest, the mechanical interest. Over in this kit somewhere, I've got a Nintendo license repair kit with the screwdrivers and the head cleaners and all the old equipment to rip apart and put together a console or a game. And that's a big business. That's a cottage industry on eBay. And I'm definitely part of that one. Even soldering the Atari to fix the sound card, like things like that.
Yeah, and if we're speaking about ideology again, I think that plays into it. The right to repair. I don't know if you followed along what's been going on in the right to repair industry,
Yes, right to repair, sure.
So that's also, I think, one of the reasons why I'm interested in knowing if that's your experience in your research as well. But like that feeds into it. That this is your hardware. You're able to repair it. You have what's it called? Schematics for the boards that you're able to repair. I went and interviewed this repair shop owner. He does retrofits. So what he does is he takes the old hardware. I gave him a Game Gear for him to fix. But he also takes like NES, or he takes Game Boys, that kind of thing, and he puts HDMI cables behind them with all the components to convert it inside the console. And so you have this whole experience, which is obviously not as authentic, but it's interesting to see how people react differently to gaming, to retro gaming.
And what's neat about this experience is, it may not have been motivated by right to repair ideologies per se, but it emerged organically. We're working with hardware that you cannot, that's gone. I mean, you can't call. It's funny that the consoles have the Nintendo line on the bottom. You can call that number. I think there are some famous stories. There was a woman in Japan a couple of years ago. You may have read about this. Her grandkids called Nintendo to replace her Game Boy, and they actually did replace her Game Boy, which it's a beautiful story, right? But that's not going to happen for most of us, right? Most of us are going to have to, if that breaks. In fact, a lot of us just turn, and again, that was eBay, right? It was just, this is pre-3D printing. It was just people who owned a game store that closed and just closed out their inventory. I also work on cars as a spare time. It's finding parts from old cars. I think that if you were to talk to retro gamers about right to repair, they would find very quickly that they align strongly with the ideology, but it may be, again, so transparent to them, they don't even realize what you're doing when you resolder your Atari to fix your sound card. When you go online, download the schematics for, I've replaced the pin connector in my NES. I haven't done it, but I've had colleagues do 3D printing of buttons and things like this. Like, what you're doing essentially is, exercising your right to repair your own information. And I think that part of the experience, for many people, I think it was a personal gratification of solving the project and solving the puzzle. But I suspect if they understood more the notion of right to repair, you would find very quickly that they would discover that those things don't exist in other parts of their lives. And again, it's that ideology by contrast. I didn't plan on being an activist, on being involved, until I saw the situation where I couldn't change the oil in my car because I don't have the right tool to take the cover off to do these things. So I don't think it's unfair to bring that up.
I find it interesting that you've studied so much the interaction and the sentiment that people have towards retro games. And I'd be interested in knowing what's the most surprising finding that you've had, like the thing that you'd never have considered, or that even if like kind of like right to repair, like it's always been at the back of your minds, but you needed to have the data in front of you to realize it.
So I always presumed that nostalgia was a personal emotion, that it was introspective, that it was thinking about me. And what I learned in our research that shocked me and really got my attention was how social it is. That it's not so much about you returning to you. It's almost a notion of returning to a social identity from the past. Being a child, not my childhood. Being with friends and peers and family, not just being in my basement. That when people would have these nostalgic experiences, either because we talked to them and had them remember one, or if we actually gave them a retro game and had them play it, they would start with the game. They would start with, oh, I remember myself, but then they would quickly talk about the good old days and a broader who we were as people. Now, it wasn't always necessarily a healthy social identity, right? If you were thinking about, diversity and inclusion. But in terms of remembering this, being connected to people, the power of family emotions, that one really surprised me. And the one that sticks out, it was one of the few times I ever got emotional reading my own data, was, we had a participant, and again, a lot of times in data analysis, you don't know who they are. It's anonymized, and it's a spreadsheet, and there's 400 people, and you're looking over lines, and you're doing a thematic analysis of common notions. And this person said, I remember playing Mario Kart with my father because he died when I was 10, and that was the last thing we did. And that stuck out. And they talked about like this experience of a family ritual, and their dad being this like fragile, fun, peer, like competitive person, but that was the last thing we did before he died. That stuck to me, and I got a lot of those, a lot of similar notions of reminding these things. So the emotional power of the experience, the reminder of who I am and who we are, maybe even what it made me today. The social and emotional experiences were far stronger. I thought people would just say, oh my gosh, that's Contra, that's so cool, I beat the game, I won, that was fun. It was so much deeper than that and so much more identity pervasive than that. And I think we're only just now discovering this. And I point it out because so many cynics of nostalgia say, oh, all you're doing is being a kid again. Well, what's wrong with that? I mean, sometimes we do need to recheck our origin story. So the fact that these things were origin stories, that is much different than just a memory.
And has that impacted how you play your games? Like when you sit down to play your car racing game, I'm guessing Forza on the PS5. Well, not Forza, that's fine. Well, either way, has that impacted how when you sit down you experience?
Yeah,
what you experience?
That's a fair question, and this is actually one of the hardest parts of the job. Is that it's when you research your hobby, it's really hard to separate the experience, right? It's really hard to separate the experience. And I try my best. I don't know if I'd say it's directly impacted the way I play. It has made me more conscious and more aware of what I'm doing when I play. When I set up the arcade down here, one of the first things I did was take a picture, send it to my brother. He and I grew up together, and said, Nathan, it took me till I was 40 years old to have the bedroom I wanted when I was 14. And he's like, oh my God, is that the old Sega? Oh my God, is that the, I remember getting in trouble with Dad and running downstairs and sneaking some friends over and doing this, right? So I think for the retro games, it's actually made me think about that. I will say I talked to my parents more about playing as a kid with them. For modern games, not as much, although what I do think I notice is that when I play with people, I start to think about it in slightly more social terms, in terms of, how do I put this? The recognizing the experience could be a lasting one. And that's kind of interesting, when you have your three colleagues over and they, once they play a game, once they engage in an activity that is rules, goal, they let down their guard and they dump into Overcooked, right? And you got four PhDs who don't know each other who are suddenly screaming on the couch and throwing popcorn and running around. And I know that 5 years from now, we're going to remember this moment when we were 40 years old, behaving like we're 13 at a slumber party. And that's going to last. And so I've somewhat allowed myself and even maybe reminded other people, like, hey, just relax. Have fun. The shouting is part of the game, right? That's the experience. So that's been a thing. I've also, broadly speaking, how do I put this? I try my best to respect other media that I don't understand. So when I see my college students on TikTok, I don't do I can't believe you're wasting your time on that damn smartphone and you're going to rot your brain. Because I remember what happened when my teachers told me the same thing. So maybe not so much for how I play games, but for how I approach and understand and appreciate and even lean into and experience media that are not part of my generation. That's probably been the lesson that I've taught myself. And if anybody learns something from my research beyond gaming, I think that's the one I'd want them to learn, is that don't do it to the kids under you, because you're going to cut off their experience, you're going to delegitimize it, and you're going to make them have to defend their right to be part of their generation. I mean, look, I'm not on TikTok, okay? Like, I just don't do it. But that's the generation, and that's fine. And maybe eventually I'll give it a shot.
I find that interesting because of some of the people I've talked to, a couple of them especially are like, we're like, oh yeah, retro gaming is going back to the past, because you see all the people nowadays on their smartphones and it's not gaming. Obviously, that's not my
sure.
things. But you see this kind of elitist point of view of gaming and of what is just, what is good. And I find that's kind of problematic in, well, most media, because as soon as you have like a fan base or a culture around something,
right,
it tends to devolve.
I do worry sometimes that retro gaming perpetuates gamer elitist stereotypes and that it only creates new gatekeeping. But think about the Marvel universe, cinematic universe. I grew up on those comics. I have them upstairs. They're everywhere. I memorize those stories. I have the original issues from the Infinity Gauntlet. Like, I got mad going to the theater and realizing that Thanos, for your viewers, spoiler alert, in the comics, he's in love with death. That's why he kills half the universe. The movies changed that, and I had a hard time with this one. And then I realized that, well, the cinematic universe is for everybody, told 20 to 30 years later, for an audience far above and beyond the 15 of us who went to the comic store on Tuesday for new books, right? And even the publishers have smartly said the cinematic universe is a separate thing. Translation, legal rights are really hard in movies, so we're not dealing with this. That's why there are no mutants in this thing. Don't worry about it. It's a long conversation. I came to quickly appreciate that there was now a shared cultural touchstone between a hardcore like myself and the person at the restaurant with the Infinity Gauntlet t-shirt on that was actually the comic, and I know they didn't read the comic, and I could quiz them right now, and they would fail the quiz. For me, it was, first, my comics are worth more money now, right? Like, because everybody wants to buy them. Second, people now know my references, so if I make a Silver Surfer reference or a Mr. Fantastic reference, it hits, right? But third, it's a good story. It's a good story. And if you're a comic fan, we've rewritten the X-Men like 50 times, like, since the 60s. We do it all. The Hulk has had so many motivations for being or not being the Hulk. Let's not pretend that there's canon, and then there's that time he was an old man, and then that time where he was actually dead. Folks, Wolverine used to be a bouncer in Las Vegas for like 12 issues. I mean, So for me, it was
All right. Let's bring it back.
Oh
to
gosh, yeah. So the point is, though, with
Sorry.
gaming, what you see is putting the walls up to protect your element devalues, I think, the arena itself. It's not a problem that there is a global respect and understanding and appreciation for your medium. It doesn't devalue your experiences because noobs are playing them now. And no matter what they do, they can't change your experience. I own this thing in the 80s and I did this, right? So where I'm going with this discussion is that I do worry that sometimes we get elite about who's a real gamer. Retro is real. You don't really know games unless you beat Contra without your code. To tell you the truth, that sort of mentality, I think, is more a byproduct of the competitive nature of gaming and the cultural identity nature of gaming that is very similar to athletics. You know, I played soccer casually, I played competitively. I played on a select team. Well, you're not really a soccer player unless you know every single player in the Bundesliga League 2. That's when you know you're a real soccer player. So it's not special to games. I point that out because that's the irony. The gamers think they're making it special by being elitist, and the irony is you're replicating the very social structures that you hate of every other hobby, of sports, of cars. So you see these groups, they all do the same thing, and what they forget is the thing that makes them unique, and it's that folks like their stuff. And so if gamers want to keep their time in the spotlight, you got to put the walls down.
Now, I'm curious, in your research, have you come across any way to like diminish that, to make sure that, to spread that message other than just putting out your research? Is there something that people can do?
Sure, I haven't. In part, my approach to research is less of an activist motivation and more of one more comics reference, I'm a watcher. I watch, I record, I redeliver. And it's sort of up to society at large to do something with that information. But in conversations like this, and in conversations with gamers, I'll often make observations sort of from the sidelines, like, you're being really rude, and I feel like people now don't want to play with you. So you could stop doing that, and people will play with you. That's kind of how I've done engage that situation. That being said, I think as the data and as my interviews with players, especially younger players, continue to reveal that. But I'm not sure it's my problem to solve or if it's a problem per se, insofar as you see it in almost every hobby group. If you're a musician, you know the music fan that's insufferable because they know the deepest cut. I mean, we even use the phrase deep cut to describe that obnoxiously nuanced information that is only used to make you better than me. So maybe in a way, it's just part of liking something. And so talking about it is the solution. And then if the person wants to fix it, they can. And if they want to be elite, then, in sports, we call it Schwabism. It's when you know so much about something, you become the Schwab, the expert, the sage. Well, if that's what you want to be, you can be that, right? But meanwhile, there's more and more and more and more people who want to play and they want to get to know you better. Some of that is a social identity threat. So if your identity is heavily tied into an activity or an experience that in your view, makes you unique, and then other people sort of casually play in that identity, there's a sense that, well, that was mine. That was the thing that made me who I am. What right do you have to just casually come in and dink with it? That's the sort of dark side of social identity, is that when you in-group and out-group, when it's us and them, I don't always want them to be with us. And this is something that I think gamers should both celebrate and resign themselves to. And Ian Bogost is a scholar at Washington University in St. Louis. He says this all the time. Gaming is mundane. It is everywhere. Gaming is not special anymore in the sense that the access we have today to a game, they are almost to the point, I mean, mundane has connotations. It doesn't have to have connotations, but it can. Gaming's everywhere. It's the curse of popularity. You become so well embraced and so well liked that now everyone's doing it all of the time, which is where that need for gatekeeping pops up. How do I make me different than you, different than them? And I don't think there's a solution to that. This is a deeply held psychological, almost implicit reaction. We don't have control over it, right? Sometimes with awareness, we can reconsider our reactions, but so many of them are implicit, right? That's a part that is interesting. We as gamers, for a moment, fought so hard to be recognized. Then we got recognized. And now we're like, get out of my conference. Stop watching my stream. But again, we see this with music, with sports, with books. I mean, go to your local bookstore. It gets just the same way. You have stratifications of, did you really read? Are you reading this book? I'm a mechanic part-time. Like, it's same way. If I go to certain forums, I can ask questions. And then in some forums, it's 18 people telling me how stupid I am. I think it's just a part of how humans understand themselves. And we're not used to doing it on a mass scale. Usually your network physically is who you identified with and as. So Alfred has an identity and Nick has an identity in a small network. When you kick it online, it's immediately threatened. There's always somebody who knows more than you, and there's always somebody who knows less than you. And that's a conversation probably for another time, but it's one that we're going to see a generation struggle with social identity in a massively multiplayer world, which is half the world plugged into one server at one time. And that's another area of my research too, by the way.
We don't have all nights or all day for you. So I would have loved to dig into like conservation and like collecting for what it means for retro games. I don't think we'll have the time to explore that, but it was fascinating to talk with you, and I hope you enjoyed our conversation as much as I did. And
absolutely, and I can give you a quick soundbite on collecting. What's neat about the collection movement is I think it reminded the industry that people still wanted this stuff. It makes perfect sense when you came out of the console wars of the 90s and the early 2000s. Why the last thing a developer would do was release a console. Most gamers don't realize consoles lose money. Companies don't make money off consoles. They're called loss leaders. You lose. It costs you more money than to sell it. You make your money back on the games, of course. So the idea of releasing a Super Nintendo in 2015 is insane. They're like, get out of here. We are not going to sell a system for the 25 old men in their basements who want to play retro games. I think when they realized that those eBay markets, that those emulation software companies that were suddenly challenging their trademarks and copyrights and patents, that stuff wasn't going anywhere. It was getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, that there was a market. And at some point, someone realized, even if it is just people in their 40s reliving, there's a lot of them and they have disposable income. But if you paid attention, it very quickly wasn't just those folks. It was going to conventions and watching teenagers gawk in awe and marvel at Blizzard's history on posters and going, wow, I wish I could play Rock and Roll Racing. That looks so cool. And then Blizzard going, you do, don't you? Well, we still have the game. Right? We'll give it to you. So as the medium matured, as it got more popular, people started realizing that, you know what? I really, really think it's cool to see the old 90s logo. And from there, the collecting market got hot. Now, I'll tell you very briefly, I hate the collector market in the sense of the sealed game. It's anathema to gaming for me. I can't do it. I love that games have gotten that expensive and popular, but as the gamer me dies every time I see a cartridge or a magazine sealed up. It crushes my heart. But again, it suggests that this cultural touchstone is everywhere. And you know, it's all market driven, and that's all attention driven, and we still love this stuff. I don't think we're ever going to get to a time when people don't love this stuff anymore. And so the collector market has reminded the world that gaming is here.
Yeah, I mean,
Gaming's
I've
here.
got so many other things I'd like to talk about, like emulation and all that entails. But yeah, let's keep that to another conversation.
Sure, no
if that's all
worries.
right with you. Absolutely. Thank you for making the time. Thank you for the short delay, and thank you for the interview.
Thanks. I'll look forward to watching this.